welcome back to the channel where biblical backgrounds matter. Continuing our historical overview lesson, we get into the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 745 to 630 BC. After a lapse of half a century, the Assyrian Empire returned much stronger than before under the capable leadership of Tiglath-Pileser III in 745. This was to become the first world-class empire known to history and the first of a line of empires that culminated in the Roman Empire. First on the Assyrian king's agenda was to consolidate dominion of Syria, which had come under the influence of Urartu, and to regain control of the trade routes. Remember that trade routes were important for the economic flow. Over his first 8 years, or 8 to 10 years, the king accomplished this goal and established a strong military presence in Syria. As part of this process, he collected tribute from Menahem, the king of Israel. While Tiglath-Pileser was pursuing this agenda, however, Rezin, king of Damascus, had his own plan. You'll remember that Damascus at this time was the capital of Syria. He had sponsored an upstart Pekah from Israel and helped him secure the throne, and together they planned to do the same sort of thing in Judah. Ahaz, the Judean king, though encouraged by the prophet Isaiah to trust the Lord for deliverance from this threat, chose to summon Tiglath-Pileser to deal with the co-conspirators. The result was the Second Western Campaign in the years 734 to 732 BC. Pekah was replaced on the throne of Israel by Hoshea, and all but the environs of Samaria were annexed as part of the Assyrian state. Remember that Samaria was part of Israel, and in fact it was the Israelite capital at that time. Rezin was killed and Damascus destroyed. In the process, Ahaz became an Assyrian vassal. Tiglath-Pileser was succeeded to the throne by Shalmaneser V, who reigned for only about 5 years. Very little is known of him, but most significantly, it was during his reign that Hoshea of Israel rebelled against Assyria. Shalmaneser's campaign to the west began a 3-year siege of Samaria. Upon its fall, the survivors were deported, the city destroyed, and the northern kingdom of Israel annexed entirely to the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC. I'm doing pretty good, how are you? When Sargon II came to the throne, the Assyrian Empire was well established. Most of Sargon's attention was focused on Urartu and Elam, although there were 3 major western campaigns. Though Hezekiah of Judah was anti-Assyrian, there was little direct action against Judah in these campaigns. That was to change, however, when Sargon's son Sennacherib came to the throne in 704. Remember that Elam later on became Persia, which is modern-day Iran. During the reign of Sargon, Babylon had declared its independence under the leadership of Merodach Baladan. For 12 years, Sargon had been unable to deal with this rebel. Merodach Baladan was finally driven from the throne, but escaped. The wily Babylonian had not been idle in the meantime, and when Sennacherib came to power, Merodach Baladan ascended the throne in Babylon and enjoyed the support of concurrent rebellions against Assyria throughout the empire, including one by Hezekiah of Judah. Sennacherib, however, had learned a lesson from his father and went immediately to the source of the trouble. Merodach Baladan became the target of a strategic campaign that quickly subdued Babylon. Having quenched the uprising in the south, Sennacherib undertook a campaign against the Western Coalition in 701 BC. He came south along the Phoenician coast and collected tribute from Sidon to Acca. After seizing some cities on the coast plain, he proceeded down into Philistine territory to Ekron. Having cut off the other allies, he was then ready to move against Judah, which was cut off from any potential help. Hezekiah paid tribute at this point, but to no avail. Then when all the Assyrian army, when all seemed lost, Hezekiah trusted the Lord for deliverance, and the Assyrian army was mysteriously slaughtered. During the night, Sennacherib's account does not report the outcome of the siege. Hezekiah was succeeded by his son, Manasseh, who adopted the Assyrian position. His long reign, spanning the first half of the 7th century, came at height of Assyrian strength and territorial control. Sennacherib's son, Esarhaddon, extended the empire to Egypt and successfully subjugated the north, but it was left to Esarhaddon's son, Ashurbanipal, to capture Thebes in 663 BC. This was the pinnacle of the Assyrian Empire's power, but the crack of deterioration was already becoming evident. I'm reading from the surveys of the Old Testament. I like to do a lot of historical research on this channel. And we have the empires in transition. Ashurbanipal had inherited an empire at its peak, but decline began in the 650s as Psammetichus gradually cleared the Assyrians out of Egypt. About this time also, there was civil war in Babylon, led by Ashurbanipal's brother with the support of the Elamites and the Chaldeans. Though this attempt was unsuccessful, the Assyrian king continued to be worn down by revolts. The last several years of his reign are very confused, and it appears that his son assumed kingship before Ashurbanipal died. Shortly after the death of Ashurbanipal in 627 BC, the Babylonians successfully achieved their independence, and the days of Assyrian strength were gone. In Judah, the decline of Assyria was good news to Josiah, who had ascended the throne at the age of 8, just 2 years after the death of his grandfather Manasseh. The reform that Josiah undertook in 628 and further in 622 BC took full advantage of the lack of Assyrian presence. At the same time, however, Egypt was strengthening its positions in Palestine. Egypt attempted simultaneously to maintain friendly relations with Assyria and to benefit from Assyria's inability to maintain control of the West. As a result, by the 630s, the major trade route was controlled by Egypt, and Egypt had a greater presence in Palestine than did Assyria. If you read the Bible from Genesis all the way into 2nd Chronicles, and then on into Ezra and Nehemiah, you can really see how all this has played out through history and how God was leading and guiding and directing everything that went on throughout history. Then from 600 to 550 BC, you had the Neo-Babylonian Empire. When the Babylonians declared independence from the Assyrians in 626, it was the Chaldean Nabopolassar who claimed the throne. For the next decade, he successfully maintained control of Babylon, but was unable to extend his rule any further into Assyrian territory. It was clear that Assyria was losing its grasp on the empire. However, and Nabopolassar was not the only one scrambling to take over the Assyrian interest. To the east, Cyaxares the Mede was also moving against major Assyrian strongholds. In 614 BC, one of those, the city of Ashur, fell to the Medes, and outside the ruins of the city, the late arriving Nabopolassar and victorious Cyaxares made a pact to join their forces against the floundering Assyrians. Their joint armies were able to bring down the mighty capital of Nineveh just 2 years later in 612 BC. The beleaguered Assyrian government retreated west and regrouped with its headquarters in Haran. Sinsharishkun had died in the fall of Nineveh, so Ashurbanipal assumed the throne, destined to become Assyria's last king. In 610, Haran capitulated, and the Assyrians were forced to retreat another 50 miles west to Carchemish on the west bank of the upper reaches of the Euphrates, just inside modern-day Turkey. Here, though reinforced by the Egyptians under Pharaoh Necho, the Assyrian Empire ended when Nebuchadnezzar, crown prince of Babylon and commander-in-chief of armies, stormed Carchemish and scattered what was left of the Assyrians, pursuing them as far south as Hamath and claiming Syria for the Babylonian realm. That very year, Nabopolassar died, and Nebuchadnezzar rushed back to Babylon, where he assumed the throne of what had now become a Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar was one of the most successful kings known to history. He ruled from 605 to 562 BC and distinguished himself in both military matters and domestic undertakings, foremost of which was the beautification of the city of Babylon. The Assyrian Empire had been divided between the Babylonians and their allies, the Medes. Between the Babylonians and their allies, the Medes. The Babylonians received the Tigris and the Euphrates basins from a line just east of the Tigris, approximating the boundary between modern states of Iraq and Iran, and all of the western states extending as far north as the southeast section of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. The Medes ruled the eastern regions, modern-day Iran. Urartu between the Black and the Caspian Seas and the eastern section of Asia Minor. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar was able to extend his domain to include Egypt in 568 BC. The establishment of the Neo-Babylonian Empire had far-reached effects on Judah, apparently hoping to contribute to the downfall of Assyria. Josiah attempted to stop the advance of the Egyptian armies, hurrying to provide assistance to Ashurbanipal at Carchemish. This proved to be a fatal decision because Josiah, who had accomplished more reform than any of his Davidic predecessors, was killed in the losing effort. He was succeeded to the throne in turn by 3 sons and a grandson. Jehoahaz, the first son, was taken into exile in Egypt after serving only 3 months. This occurred upon Necho's return from Syria in 609 BC. Jehoiakim, a second son, was placed on the throne instead. Once Nebuchadnezzar had defeated the Assyrian-Egyptian coalition and claimed control of Syro-Palestine, Jehoiakim became a Babylonian vassal. This lasted until he rebelled in 598 BC. By the time Nebuchadnezzar came west, Jehoiakim had died, and his son Jehoiakim was on the throne. The city of Jerusalem was set under siege and surrendered on March 16, 597 BC. Jehoiakim had died, and Jehoiakim was taken to exile in Babylon, along with many of the people, including the prophet Ezekiel. Nebuchadnezzar set Zedekiah, Josiah's third son, on the throne. Almost from the start, Zedekiah became involved in seditious schemes against the Babylonians. And finally, with the promise of Egyptian support, he rebelled in 589 BC. The Babylonian army arrived in 588 BC and blockaded Jerusalem to prevent its stockpiling supplies, while other fortified cities were defeated. That summer, the siege was lifted briefly as the Babylonians were diverted to meet at an Egyptian force, and then was reinstated. By the following summer, July 587 BC, the walls were breached and Jerusalem was sacked. The temple burned and the people were deported to Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian Empire did not long survive the death of Nebuchadnezzar. He was succeeded by 4 relatively obscure and apparently incompetent kings, and one could say the handwriting was on the wall long before the fateful feast of Belshazzar. On the eve of the fall of Babylon the Great, in fact, Cyrus had begun moving to consolidate his power within 5 years of the death of Nebuchadnezzar. I'll stop right there for now, and then I'll come back to y'all with more information later. And y'all have a good rest of the day, and hope this video was helpful to you in your studies.